This is part 2 of the committee's hearing on the annual testimony of the Secretary of the Treasury on the state of the international financial system, which convened on April 9, 2019. As agreed with the ranking member, without objection, this hearing is deemed a continuation of that hearing, and we will go to members who did not have the opportunity to question the witness on April 9th. We have the Secretary until 10:45 this morning, which accounts for our early start today. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here this morning. The recent tax hike bill had a devastating impact on my district, the 5th District of New Jersey, gutting the state and local tax deduction, better known as SALT, sharply limiting New Jersey's property tax deductions, and imposing a massive tax hike on New Jersey's families and businesses. Last year, I worked with New Jersey officials on legislation to provide real tax relief for my constituents via tax credits for charitable contributions to our towns. After New Jersey passed law, the IRS, without any legislative basis, against legal precedent, and decades of previous IRS approvals, issued provisional rules that would severely limit New Jersey's ability to offer tax relief through the charitable deduction, undermining New Jersey's new law, allowing our towns to use it. And it also hurt, as you probably know, 33 other states like Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina that have been using the charitable provision for decades now. It's not a red state or blue state issue, Mr. Secretary, but I really believe that Congress didn't give you or the IRS permission to interpret the new tax law as they see fit. These rules are still provisional, and I just was asking you if you have a status update for us on the limits on the charitable tax deduction for these purposes.
Well, first of all, let me just say I do appreciate the SALT deduction is having impact on some of the economies, and we are monitoring that carefully. We did allow for a deduction that did cover a very significant amount of the people. As it relates to the charitable deduction, this administration very much supports charitable deductions, as does the department. I think the issue that you're referring to is that there are no limits on charitable deductions where there are not a quid pro quo attached. The question I think you're referring to is where certain states tried to get around the federal law by passing certain laws, and I understand that's still under further review by the IRS and our legal department. But
what about the 33 states that have been using this for decades now? Should they have to stop immediately?
Well, again, we've spent a lot of time on this guidance. We are trying to make sure that the legitimate use of tax credits is still allowed. I believe the guidance is still under review, and we're happy to follow up with your office.
Do you have a sense of timing of when we're going to have when those rules will go final?
I think it's going to be out shortly. It is a priority of ours. Again, we want to make sure that legitimate use of charitable contributions is supported.
I know you were very involved personally, which is a little unusual in the approval process of these guidelines. Why did you feel a need to get personally involved in these particular ones? I know most of you don't, right?
No, actually, that's not the case. We meet almost daily with a team at Treasury, Office of Tax Policy, General Counsel, all of our areas, and we review actually every single regulation. I think it's my obligation, given the complexity of these issues, to make sure that I'm briefed on them. So this issue is no different than others.
Thank you. On SALT for a second, you advocated for SALT cuts by saying they, quote, predominantly benefited high-income earners to help pay for major tax cuts for American families, and estimated that, quote, approximately 5% of taxpayers will itemize and have state and local income tax deductions above the SALT cap. In my state, in New Jersey, 42.75, not 5%, of taxpayers in the 5th District, or approximately 359,000 people in the 4 counties I represent, actually claimed a SALT deduction. That's far from 5%. In fact, the average in Bergen County, one of my counties, is $24,783. After hearing the impact and reviewing this tax season, do you have a different view at all on these claims of what you originally said, sir?
Well, we're monitoring it carefully. I would comment that there are a lot of people with SALT deductions that do have AMT relief. I do think it does hit the high end of taxpayers significantly, but we are monitoring the impact on these economies and watching it carefully.
Thank you, sir. In the remaining time, if I can quickly ask you an Iran question. Last November, the full set of sanctions waived under the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran came back into effect. What impact do you see these newly imposed sanctions having, and where do you see issues with compliance?
I see these new sanctions being very impactful. They are having the impact that we want, which is absolutely limiting the amount of money that's going to Iran that's used for terrorist activities, that's used for military purposes. We were very pleased with the progress in the enforcement of these sanctions. So it's something we're monitoring very carefully.
Thank you very much for your time, sir. Thank you. I yield. Thanks.
The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for convening this morning's hearing. And Mr. Secretary, thank you for coming back this morning. Back in November, ahead of the G20 summit, you released a statement regarding the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, and I appreciate you doing that. 2 questions. As you know, Congress is faced with passing or not passing the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. 2 questions. Can you address what happens to the economy if, in fact, we do pass the USMCA? Second question, can you address the effects on the economy if we don't pass the USMCA?
Sure. Well, I am hopeful that Congress takes this up soon. I know Ambassador Lighthizer has had productive discussions with the Speaker on this because I think it has a very important economic impact. I think it's been estimated anywhere between 30 and 100 basis points in terms of GDP, which is a very big number. These are 2 of our largest trading partners. This has a lot of support from the governors, has a lot of bipartisan support from business. So the impact is quite significant, and I am pleased that we've reached an agreement with Canada and Mexico on steel and aluminum tariffs, which, again, is another reason to move forward with the agreement quickly.
And what would be the effect on the economy if we don't pass the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement?
It could be quite significant in the other direction, depending what happens, whether we stick with the existing NAFTA deal or whether we terminated the NAFTA deal. So, very, very positive economic to move forward on it. So I'm encouraged, and hopefully the House will take it up soon.
Thank you. As it relates to CECL, the current expected credit loss, I've talked to a number of I'm concerned with community banks, especially. In my area, which is West Tennessee, we have some really good, strong community banks who are concerned about the effects that the CECL implementation would have on them and their ability to lend money. Have you or anybody in Treasury or any regulators conducted a study to assess the potential impacts to banks, and especially to community banks, if CECL is in fact implemented, or those standards are implemented in the next year or so?
So I share some of your concerns. We've had discussions at the FSOC over this. We've had discussions with the Fed and other regulators about delaying the impact on it, on stress testing and other things. So I think the regulators understand this issue. They're trying to look at it carefully. It is an accounting provision, so it's something we are focused on, and we hope that the transition will alleviate some of the concerns that you've addressed, but this is an issue we continue to study.
I appreciate that. My district, which is part of Memphis and then West Tennessee, has a large ag component. In fact, it's the largest ag district in the state of Tennessee. I hear from a lot of my farmers about tariffs and the impacts of tariffs. I'm characterizing, but generally, the farmers are supportive of the president. They're willing to endure short-term pain for longer-term gain. That's not everybody, but generally. If you were a member of Congress representing an agricultural district, what would you tell farmers about tariffs and what the potential impacts and hopefully the potential positive effects that they may have?
Well, I can assure you the president is very focused on the agriculture community and the farmers specifically. We talk about it almost weekly. Sonny Perdue participates in our trade meetings and represents the farmers in those meetings. I think the good news is, as it relates to lifting some of these tariffs with Mexico, that will help the farmers substantially in terms of trade with Mexico and reciprocal issues. And it relates to China. If we can get a good deal, it will also be very good for the farmers. I think, as unfortunately we were on track for that and we've gone backwards. The President and Secretary Perdue are looking at various different programs to make sure as we take in tariffs, we can use some of that money to support the farmers. So I can assure you the President is very focused on this.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and I yield back my remaining time.
Thank you. The gentleman from Utah, Mr. McAdams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, thank you for coming back to the committee this morning. As you may know, Utah leads the nation with the highest number of children per family on average. I myself have 4 kids, so the cost of household goods and children's items specifically is a big concern in my district, a big concern for my constituents as they map out their household budgets every month. So I wanted to read to you a list of items this administration is proposing to tax in its trade dispute with China. And I know you refer to these as tariffs, but in reality, Utahns and Utah business leaders and Americans are the ones paying these costs. So I'll call them what they are, a tax. I'm going to read a few of these items from the USTR's Federal Register notice on proposed List 4 tariffs, all of which will potentially be taxed up to 25%. Baby diapers, infant formula, children's footwear, infant nursery monitor systems, strollers, high chairs and bouncers, baby carriages, and child safety seats. And these are just some of the items that are related to babies and infants. It's by no means an exhaustive list because the list also includes all forms of clothing and items that are also used by adults. In fact, you have 76 pages of items that you want to tax at a rate of 25%. That's these items right here in the Federal Register. 76 pages of items that would receive a 25% tax. So, Mr. Secretary, I understand that you and this administration want to address China's unfair trade practices, and I support that. But I don't think the strategy and rationale behind this process has been properly explained, and I don't think you've properly consulted Congress throughout the process. So I guess my question is, what do I tell mothers and fathers in my district when the price of their baby formula and diapers goes up? What if they can't afford those price increases? Should they just go without buying diapers or not buy a car seat for their kid? What do I tell them? What do I tell them? I'll let you respond.
Well, first let me comment. I'd be more than happy to come up and meet with you and a bunch of your colleagues and explain in a smaller setting our thoughts on this and it. You have a very valid point on these issues, so let me make a couple of points. First of all, these are proposed tariffs. They are not in place. Number 2, there will be an exception process as part of this 301. We've already had many productive meetings with Commerce and USTR and others. And 3, I can tell you I am monitoring the situation very carefully. I was on the phone with the CFO of Walmart, which is obviously one of the biggest sellers of the items that you've described, to specifically understand from Walmart what things they can source from other areas and what items they can't. I would say we haven't made any decisions yet, but we will be especially sensitive to the consumer items. And within the consumer items, I assure you that items that particularly affect people on fixed salaries and have 4 kids and others. So there has no decision been made on any of these items, and I assure you we will monitor it very carefully before we raise all these items.
Well, and I would just say, I mean, people are alarmed. People are seeing their costs go up already in anticipation of these tariffs. Has the administration set up the exclusion process that you referred to for round 3 on the China tariffs?
We are working on setting up the exclusion process now. I haven't seen the prices go up. I've been monitoring this very carefully.
Is there a plan for an exclusions process for round 4?
Yes, there is. And I would also just comment, given the depreciation of the Chinese currency, a big component of this is being paid for by China because as the currency depreciates, our companies are being able to buy things at lower prices. But we are very carefully monitoring the consumer prices, and that's something that I can assure you the President will be very focused on before we make any decisions.
Well, I just want to make sure, I want my constituents to not be taxed, to not feel this pain in their monthly budgets as they're trying to balance budgets, put food on the table, provide for their kids and their children's safety. When can we expect any future announcement on the exclusion process?
Well, I think you know the process of round 4, there won't be any decision probably for another 30 or 45 days, and we will have an exclusion process built and ready if the President decides to go forward with that.
Thank you. I know that Representative Ron Kind has introduced legislation here in the House that would require such a process as well, and I'm a co-sponsor of that legislation. And for the sake of the peace and assurances of the American people, I hope we'll get this process moving as soon as possible. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Riggleman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'm over here on the end. And thank you, Mr. Secretary, for coming back to committee this morning. I know the title of this hearing is the state of the international financial system, but before we get into that, I wanted to quickly discuss a tax issue. The IRS recently announced that corporate alternative minimum tax refunds received under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will no longer be subject to sequestration, but AMT refunds received by taxpayers in lieu of claiming bonus depreciation under Section 168 will remain subject to sequestration. Taxpayers earn no interest on AMT prepayments and are counted dollar for dollar against future liabilities. These prepayments operate as interest-free loans to the government that remain until the taxpayer incurs a liability to which the AMT credit is applied. In many cases, these prepayments extend for decades. The only way to receive an AMT credit is to pay the tax, so these are not loopholes exploited by American businesses, but serve as a way to reduce their tax liabilities should they owe money to our favorite uncle, Sam. I don't support a policy that treats these taxpayers differently, particularly in the case where the AMT credits represent prepayments or overpayments of tax and should not be subject to sequester. And, sir, can I get your commitment today that you will look into the actions that the IRS can and should take on behalf of these companies on the AMT credit specifically to remedy this situation?
Yes, I can tell you I am familiar with it. It is a technical issue. We're working with OMB on trying to resolve it. So
thank you. Thank you. And I knew that was probably a pretty quick answer, so thank you for that. And following up on tax issues, on March 5th of this year, the Department of Treasury released a policy statement on the tax regulatory process. This policy statement established the IRS's commitment to notice and comment rulemaking, the limited use of temporary regulations, and the proper role of guidance documents. One key assertion of this policy statement says sub-regulatory guidance is not intended to affect taxpayer rights or obligations independent from underlying statutes or regulations. And unlike statutes and regulations, sub-regulatory guidance does not have the force and effect of law. I wholeheartedly agree with this statement, and what I love about a bureaucracy is we actually have guidelines about guidelines. I think that's incredible. Would you be willing to would you be willing to officially adopt this position as the chair of FSOC?
I will review that with FSOC and take it up with them. Sounds like a good idea.
Thank you very much. I think the entire administration needs to have the same view of guidance. I would argue that if this document is good enough for the IRS, it should be equally appropriate for the FSOC or any federal regulatory body in the United States. And again, it's just based on my business background with regulations about guidance. I see my time is running a little bit short, but one final topic I want to discuss is cybersecurity. In June of 2017, Treasury issued a report titled Non-Bank Financial Fintech and Innovation. In this report, Treasury states, regulatory fragmentation, overlap, and duplication, however, can lead to ineffective regulatory oversight and inefficiencies that are costly to the taxpayers, consumers, and businesses. By the way, Mr. Secretary, I think you can see a theme in my questioning today. The report also says that cybersecurity is addressed among a broad group of federal and state regulators through the Financial and Banking Information Infrastructure Committee, FBIIC. When the prudential regulators were here last week, this is something I talked about. I also noted that the FBIIC, or the Financial and Banking Information Infrastructure Committee, is chaired by Treasury and comprised of over 15 members from additional regulators. Can you quickly discuss how Treasury is working with the numerous regulatory bodies to harmonize cybersecurity regulations to protect consumers without creating too cumbersome a framework?
Yes, thank you. It is a major priority of mine. We've added additional resources to the department. We've met with public and private partnerships on this, and we really have two tasks. One is harmonization across the regulators. We've recently had a productive meeting with the bank CEOs and the regulators on that. And the second is making sure we have better coordination between our intel, our technical people, and the private sector to make sure that we're fully prepared.
Thank you very much. I think just in closing, I would ask, as we go forward, I would just hope that we don't have any guidance come out about sub-regulatory guidance, which is about the guidance that's actually not regulations. Thank you, and I yield my time.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Virginia, Mrs. Wexton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us here today. I'd like to talk a little bit about your refusal to comply with a lawful subpoena from the Ways and Means Committee. As you know, Section 6103 F1 says that the Secretary shall furnish the Ways and Means Committee with any return or return information specified in requests. You're aware of that, right? Okay. And you're also aware that nowhere in that section is the chairman of Ways and Means required to include a reason, a legislative reason for the request. You're aware of that as well?
I've read the language.
But in your letter dated May 17th to Chairman Neal, you rely on advice from the DOJ in determining that the request lacks a legitimate legislative purpose. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, you understand that we're the legislative branch, so we make decisions about legislating, right?
I understand that there are 3 branches of government, and they perform different functions.
And you're the executive branch, right?
That is correct.
Which executes the laws. You don't make the laws. Right. We make the laws. Now, we learned last night of a second opinion, which was written by the IRS Chief Counsel's Office. Are you aware of that letter? Or of that memo?
I became aware of that memo when it was, we got an inquiry from the Washington Post, and it was just recently published. I'm not sure who the author of that was, but I've seen it in the Washington Post.
Okay. So when did the Washington Post inquire of you about your knowledge?
I believe the day before yesterday they called us up. And we confirmed that that I and the commissioner were not aware of that letter and had not seen it.
But you have since that time reviewed that memo?
Actually, I haven't reviewed it. I looked at it literally on the way up here. Someone handed me the printed copy of it, so I would not describe that as I've reviewed it.
Did somebody make you aware that the memo states that the law does not require that the Ways and Means Committee Finance Chair or JCT Chief of Staff include a reason or purpose for the request?
Again, I haven't, again, let me just say the legal advice that we've relied upon. And again, I understand there's 3 branches of government, and when it comes to constitutional issues, there could be different interpretations, and that's why there's a 3rd branch of government to interpret.
But I'm sorry, reclaiming my time. You are at least aware that the conclusion of that memo directly contradicts the conclusion that you're relying upon.
No, I actually don't believe that's the case. That memo, I understand, is addressing a different issue and is not addressing the issue that we in the Department of Justice looked at. But again, let me just say, this is not a letter that came to our attention earlier.
Madam Chair, reclaiming my time. Who at the IRS would have made the decision not to run this memo up the chain?
I have no idea.
Are you going to plan to find that out?
We're trying to find out who wrote the memo, where it came from, when it was, and why it wasn't distributed, yes.
Have you had any conversations with the President at any time prior to your confirmation or today, or to today, about your desire or willingness to provide the President's tax returns to Congress?
I've had no conversations ever with the President or anyone in the White House about delivering the President's tax returns to Congress.
I want to switch gears and talk for a minute about Jamal Khashoggi. The Washington Post columnist and Virginia resident was brutally killed at the Saudi Arabian consulate in Istanbul. The Saudi government has already acknowledged its role in the killing of Mr. Khashoggi. The CIA has reportedly established with high confidence that it was an assassination that was ordered by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Do you accept the intelligence community's assessment of what happened?
Let me just first comment that it's obviously a horrible situation that he was killed. I can't comment. I obviously
Do you
have
accept
access
the intelligence community's assessment?
Again, what I would just like to say is I have access to all of the classified information. It would be inappropriate for me to make comments on the CIA intelligence that has not been
Reclaiming my time,
released.
Madam Chair. Okay, so let me back up a little bit. So you met with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman less than 3 weeks after the disappearance of Mr. Khashoggi, right?
I did. I was scheduled to speak there, which I canceled, but I did meet with him and talk to him about terrorist financing, and I obviously had private conversations.
There's a picture that was tweeted out by the Kingdom on October 22nd. Is that you in that picture with?
That is, and we also
yes.
had private conversations about the Khashoggi investigation at that time.
Okay, so you were fine with appearing publicly with Mohammed bin Salman?
I canceled my public speech. I was in a meeting privately, and there were photographers, and I thought it was the appropriate thing to deliver a message to him from the president.
Thank you, Madam.
Has expired. The gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairwoman and Secretary Mnuchin. Thank you for the courtesy of coming back today. I'm especially pleased that as the vice-ranking member of Financial Services and also the vice-ranking member of Foreign Affairs that we are focusing on the state of the international financial system here today. Mr. Secretary, I was pleased to see that the U.S. seized a North Korean cargo ship earlier this month carrying coal. North Korea has also conducted missile tests this month for the first time in almost a year and a half with missiles that appeared to resemble Russian technology. As talks with the North Koreans stall and North Korea demonstrates its increasing aggression, what specific measures can we expect to come from Treasury, sir?
Well, the president is determined that we continue our efforts to enforce both the UN sanctions and the U.S. sanctions against North Korea, and they've had a very important effect on bringing the chairman to the negotiating table, and we will continue to enforce those sanctions.
Especially in the banking arena?
Across multiple arenas, yes, they've all been very effective.
Mr. Secretary, the Obama administration mistakenly believed that Burma was on the path to reform, and it lifted sanctions and embraced IFI investment. Given that Burma has continued to commit atrocities against ethnic groups across the country, do you think IFIs should continue engaging with Burma? And if so, how can they help prompt a more rights-respecting environment?
I'm concerned about the situation there. We will continue to have discussions with the IFIs and others and monitor this situation so that there is the appropriate outcome.
Well, I hope that we will impose additional sanctions that were lifted by the Obama administration, given the path that has been taken vis-a-vis the atrocities that are happening against so many different ethnic groups. Burmese civil society organizations have expressed concerns with the IFC's lending proposals in luxury development projects, infrastructure, and agribusiness, given the country's corrupt business environment and its lack of property rights. How has the IFC used its position to promote transparency and inclusive economic development in Burma?
Well, let me just say I share your concerns. I know our international department has been having conversations, and I expect to see David Malpass very soon, and I will raise this specifically to his attention. There is no reason in my mind that the IFC and others should be doing this without the appropriate conditions attached.
Well, and I'd be very pleased to send some information along, some questions, if you'll be having those discussions.
Please do.
Thank you. After issuing its first U.S. dollar-denominated bond issued this month, the China-backed Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or the AIIB, raised $2.5 billion and attracted orders of more than $4.4 billion. The AIIB has said that the funds will be used to invest in infrastructure projects across Asia, where the AIIB is a major financier of Belt and Road projects. What are the World Bank, IMF, and Asian Development Bank doing to support the Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, I can speak for the IMF and the World Bank, and they are both very focused on debt transparency and making sure that China follows rules of debt transparency that are consistent with the Paris Club and others, and making sure that if debt is taken on by these countries, that it is sustainable and that they can afford it. And if there's proper financing for infrastructure, that's one thing. But if there's money that's designed to loan to own, that's inappropriate.
And how is the U.S. ensuring that countries aren't becoming overly indebted to China or entering predatory contracts?
Well, those are conversations we have at the G20 consistently, and I think there is a lot of support from all of our allies on this issue.
Thank you. I'm about to run out of time, but I would like to forward some information about Burma to you for your further discussions. Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I want to revisit Treasury's decision to delist Rusal, EM Plus, and associated entities owned and controlled at the time by Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska. Just to remind you of the fact pattern here, Congress is informed on December 19th, literally the day we are breaking for the holiday break, that it is Treasury's intention to delist these entities. Nonetheless, Congress acts on January 17th with strong veto-proof majority in the House to disapprove of the delisting. The Senate acts as well, but not with veto-proof majorities. And despite this disapproval on the part of the United States Congress, on January 27th, the Treasury, in fact, delists Rusal and EM Plus as a result of the deal that was struck. Since then, Mr. Deripaska's net worth, in as much as I can calculate it, has risen by $2 billion, largely as a result of the doubling of the share price of EN Plus and his remaining stake. That's what we can see visibly. Lord Barker of Battle, who engineered this deal, the executive chairman of EM Plus, received a $5 million bonus for his success in engineering this deal. Lord Barker of Battle, of course, denied access to classified information by the British Parliament because of his ties to Russia. And what I worry about most is what the leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, says or sees. Deripaska says, "I don't separate myself from the Russian state. I have no other interest." So Vladimir Putin sees the Treasury act in contravention of the will of Congress to deliver this remarkable gift to Mr. Deripaska, a guy who associates himself with Russian interest at a time that we're really coming to understand the full effect of the Russian interference in our election. We know what they're doing in Syria. We know what they're doing around the world. So, Mr. Secretary, my question is, and I got into the weeds with you on this, I know, in a classified session. I had the opportunity to talk to OFAC. I understand the process and the mechanics. But I wonder if you can tell me what American interest was served, what strategic interest was served by the decision to delist EN Plus and to massively increase Mr. Deripaska's net worth?
Well, let me give you a brief answer now, and I'd be happy to follow up with you. First of all, let me just say many people in Treasury, including myself and a large group of career staff, spent a long time on this transaction and negotiating this transaction. First of all, it was our decision to put him on the sanctions list despite what we knew this would do to the aluminum markets. We were pleased with the negotiations. We think that this shows that sanctions work, that not only has this administration done more sanctions on Russia than anybody previously, but
Mr. Treasurer, I don't mean to be rude, but when you say that, I've heard you say that before, that sanctions work, and I've heard you say on multiple occasions that the point of sanctions is to change behavior. So please elaborate on what you just said. How, in this case, did sanctions work? How did Mr. Deripaska change his behavior? Russia change his behavior? How did they work in this case?
Well, what we've done is we've effectively separated him from the company. We've put in a compliance system with U.S. and European people on the board, which is unprecedented. And as it relates to strategic issues, I would just also comment there were many workers throughout Europe. This isn't just workers in Russia. And we think this is a perfect example of where sanctions work. There was a change in behavior by the company. The company was delisted. But
I'm sorry, tell me what the change in behavior on the part of the company was?
The change in behavior is the company has separated themselves from Deripaska and has agreed to an unprecedented compliance program with the board, a Russian company now controlled by a board of non-Russians. It's somewhat unheard of.
Well, first of all, they haven't separated themselves. The Deripaska continues to own a 45% stake in the company, and there's questions about whether he continues to control it. And I understand you may feel some obligation to European workers, but my question really was, what American interest, what American strategic interest was served by this deal, which had the effect, undeniably, of massively enriching Mr. Deripaska?
Again, this was never about kind of trying to make Deripaska's net worth go up or down. This was separating Deripaska from the company. His voting interest went down to 35%. He has no management responsibility. We have unprecedented visibility into one of the largest Russian companies and the second largest aluminum company in the world. This is why
I understand the mechanics, sir. I'm having a hard time understanding. Look, and Ms. Gacki came and spent a lot of time with me. I got the mechanics. I understand them. I still do not see what American interest was served here, and that's my question to you.
Well, I believe the American interests were served in separating the company, but I'd be more than happy to talk to you more about it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lucas, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, I really only have one question, and I think it's a relatively simple question. I would open with an observation that you are obviously a man of patience, or you wouldn't be here again today. I consider myself also to be a person of patience, might be a better way to describe that. And before I ask my question, just to observe that I have been, like the chairwoman and a handful of other members, a member of this committee for a very, very long time. And I view us in many ways like a corporate board, responsible to the entities that own the enterprise, responsible to customers, responsible for the success of the process. So I come at that with my question. In 2017, the Treasury Department's capital markets made recommendations related to the lack of harmonization between CFTC and banking regulators regarding initial inter-affiliate margin. As you are well, the regulators have not yet decided to implement your recommendation. Last week, I asked the heads of the banking regulators if they intended to prioritize implementing your recommendation. Based on their answers, I'm now very concerned they may try to make it a part of a much larger review of the Fed's regulations, one which could literally drag out for years. So this is my concern, and I've been raising it for nearly 5 years, but it remains unaddressed. Do you agree that a fix on inter-affiliate margin requirements should be a priority, and will you impress upon those agencies of the importance of acting?
Yes, and thank you for acknowledging my patience.
Absolutely, Mr. Secretary, because if we don't address this, we will drive resources and we'll drive business out of this country, a reflection, I think, of the topic of this hearing. And after pursuing this for nearly 5 years, I would simply say, when I chaired another committee, it took me 2.5 years to pass a farm bill that would successfully pass a Republican House, a Democrat Senate, and be signed by a Democrat President. I and my former colleague from Tennessee, when it came time to do what was necessary to reauthorize the Export-Import Bank, literally used an extraordinary legislative process from 1910 to take it away from a then chairman and over the heads of an entire majority leadership to get a piece of legislation all the way to the president's desk to be signed. I just simply observe, after 5 years, it's time. And if the agencies can't bring themselves to focus to address this issue, perhaps it's time to help them. I simply use you as the courier of the message, Mr. Secretary. I appreciate your responses. Yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Asney, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters, and thank you, Secretary Mnuchin, for being here again. I appreciate it. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about tariffs and trade. I'm from Iowa, so of course we're being hit hard. First of all, I appreciate the removal of the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum. However, those were put on by your administration, but thank you so much for removing those. But I want to talk to you about the tariffs that were just placed on Chinese goods this month. And the tariff is almost on $200 billion of imports, and it was just increased from 10% to 25%. Do you agree with President Trump that China is footing the bill for these tariffs?
I agree that China is fitting most of the bill for it, yes.
So who's paying the price for these?
Well, again, when you look at the tariffs, there's probably 3 or 4 different things that are going on. One is a change in the currency, which leads to a lower price for us, that we can buy things. 2, it's margins that are being absorbed by companies in China. And 3, there may be in certain cases a impact passed on to our consumer, and we're closely monitoring that, and that'll be part of the exception process.
I appreciate you bringing up that last piece because major retailers like Walmart have said they will raise prices as a result of your administration's tariffs. Do you understand how a tariff operates, and could you tell us a little bit about that?
I'm not sure if you were here when I mentioned earlier that I just spoke to the CFO of Walmart. We speak on a regular basis. So I'm monitoring with them very carefully.
So are tariffs a tax on imports?
Tariffs are a tariff on imports. They are not a tax.
Tariffs are a tax on imports, and they're paid for by the U.S. companies who import those goods. So do our companies like Nike and Adidas and Walmart, who have said they're going to pass on these prices to consumers, would you not consider that an increase on costs on folks like mine in Iowa and Americans across this country?
Well, what I mentioned earlier, and the reason why I spoke to Walmart is because obviously they have a lot of these consumer issues. The way the tariffs were designed was the last tranche was really the consumer issue. We are monitoring carefully. There will be some exceptions. My expectation is a lot of this business will be moved from China to other places in the region so that there will not be a cost.
So reclaiming my time, I'm not getting a straight answer here. Do you agree that American consumers will be paying more as a result of these tariffs?
I don't necessarily agree with that, and that's something we're monitoring very carefully, and we'll be issuing exemptions.
So you disagree with all of our key retailers in the country and experts who understand that a tariff is most likely passed on to consumers because that's historically what happens. You disagree with that as the Secretary of the Treasury?
I just spoke to many of these CEOs. Many of the
Do you disagree with that the tariffs won't be passed on to consumers in any way, shape, or form?
Again, there may be a small number of items where the tariff may be passed on, and those are the things we will specifically...
So you agree that American consumers will be paying more because of the tariffs?
We've made no decisions on that. The last tranche is subject to the President's approval and subject to exemptions. So
I think it's the importers that make the decisions on that. Isn't that correct? It's their products that they're importing?
Excuse me?
The decision is being made by the folks in our country who own the companies who are importing the products, not necessarily you who's deciding what price they're going to put out on their product.
Well, again, if we issue an exemption, then there will be no price increase. And again, most of those companies are moving products to other places.
Reclaiming my time. Moving on, can you tell me what the average Iowan makes in a year?
I can't tell you exactly, but I would guess it's...
Can you tell me what the average American family makes in a year?
Yeah, it's between, depending upon whether you use the mean or the median, it's between 45 and 65,000.
Yeah, its median is 60,000, closer to 79,000 for the mean. Can you tell me what cost these tariffs will put on these American families?
I don't expect there will be significant costs on the American families, and that's something that we are absolutely focused on.
Have you done research on this?
I have. As I said, I've just spoken to all the major companies that provide consumer goods.
So if you've done research on this, how come we haven't seen this research? I haven't seen it. I don't think my colleagues have seen it. Why hasn't that been passed on to us to ensure that the constituents in our district aren't paying the cost for this?
Well, let me just comment. The last tranche is under investigation. The President has not yet made the decision, and the consumer products are by design in the last tranche.
So will you commit to providing us this research then?
Again, at the appropriate time, we will brief Congress on what the economic impact is of it, yes.
Okay, well, let's move on.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gooden, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Also wanted to congratulate you because after today you will hold the record for the longest time served in a hearing by any Secretary of the Treasurer. So apologies for not marking the occasion better.
Thank you. I think it'll be 5 hours.
Oh, very good. Well, we're happy to have you. I was going to ask more about these tax returns. My colleagues across the aisle seem to be so obsessed with these tax returns. Has anyone in the administration asked you to release tax returns for members of Congress or anyone else for political purposes?
No, they haven't. And both Chairman Brady, when he ran the committee, and now Chairman Grassley have not asked for those returns, which they would have the right to ask for, subject to constitutional protections.
And I've also heard that it's important for the Ways and Means Committee and others in Congress to determine whether or not the IRS is actually auditing our president and vice president. Is there any reason to think that the IRS isn't doing their job with respect to audits?
No, we've offered to brief the committee on the audit process. They haven't taken us up on that, but I don't see any reason why they need access to actual returns to understand that the process of the audit is fair and going through correctly.
You were asked earlier today, in today's Washington Post, there's a story about a confidential memo from the IRS. Do you make your decisions based on what's on the front page of the Washington Post or confidential memos that you haven't seen? Is that how you do business as the Treasury?
Very rarely. I don't think I've made a decision on that basis. I would also just comment, the memo is marked draft. It was not a final memo, but I don't know how it got to the Washington Post. It would have been more interesting if it had got to me or the commissioner to review.
Well, I want to thank you for your work. I want to thank you for standing up for the American taxpayer. I don't believe that tax returns should be used for political purposes, and I believe you share that. Republicans certainly shared that when they were in power in the House a few months ago. And I want to encourage you to continue fighting for the American taxpayer, and thank you for your work.
I assure you, weaponizing the IRS is a major concern of ours that affects all taxpayers in both parties.
Well, I think if you're looking for evidence that the U.S. Congress doesn't need tax returns of American citizens, you can look no further than the House Financial Services and Ways and Means Committee. So thank you. I yield back.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Adams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Mnuchin, for returning. You know, you said you're patient. I'm patient, too, but I've got to tell you, I'm losing patience with the President. Do you know how many times President Trump has publicly offered to release his tax returns?
I do not.
Well, we should have something on the screen. He's personally offered to give us a glimpse of his tax returns at least 24 times. It was scrolling on the screen, and it'll probably be back up. It was April 19th, 2011, in an interview when he first said that. And he said that if President Obama would release his birth certificate, then he'd release his tax reforms. But, of course, President Obama did do what he said he'd do, and the President did not do what he said he'd do. So do you think the American people have a right to know what's in those tax forms?
No, I don't. Presidents are not required to, and the American public knew that he didn't release them before they voted for him. So that's...
All right, I'm reclaiming my time now. Do you know what the President's hiding?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Do you know what he's hiding? I mean, he doesn't want anybody to see him, certainly not the Congress.
I don't think he's hiding anything, but
okay,
no.
So you don't know.
Correct. I don't know anything about his tax return.
All right, so we've heard a lot of excuses over the years about why he could not release them. He said, well, it was under audit, but once they finished that, he would release them. But an IRS commissioner confirmed that an audit is not necessary for you to release your tax returns. Are you aware of that?
I am, but that's the President's decision, and I'm not involved in the President's decision.
All right, let me reclaim my time. I want to get through my questions. So are you familiar with Congress's oversight authority?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So it's found in the Constitution and public laws and the House and Senate rules, and it does say that when the request is made by the appropriate offices that he should release them. Are you aware of that?
I've read the law. I've also been advised of the interpretation of the law, and I understand the constitutional issues.
All right. So why haven't you complied with with Chairman Neal's request?
Because I think that would be unlawful as advised by the Department of Justice, and that's why there's a third branch of government that most likely will
We're
review
aware
this.
of that. Let me reclaim my time, sir. So are you aware then that by denying this that you are in direct violation of the law?
No, absolutely not. I have been advised I am not violating the law. I never would have done anything that violated the law, and quite the contrary, I've been advised that had I turned them over, I would be violating the law.
All right, let me move on, sir. So are you alleging that Chairman Neal lacks a legislative purpose, and that is the basis for your refusing his request?
Well, given that this is now most likely going to litigation, I think my letters have been quite clear in why we have denied the request, and that's
all right.
based upon
Okay,
the advice
sir.
of
Let
the
me
Department of
move
Justice.
on. Thank you very much. So, are you intending to comply with the request at all?
No,
Yes or
I've made clear.
You're not.
We've
Okay.
sent him a letter that it would be unlawful for us
All right.
to
Okay,
comply
sir. I'm reclaiming my time. Now, have you told the IRS not to respond to Chairman Neal's request?
The IRS independently, the chairman independently wrote a letter concurring with my position.
Yeah, can you give me a yes or no? Have you?
You repeat the question?
Have you told the IRS not to respond to the request?
Again, I just said the IRS independently wrote a letter concurring
Sir,
with my...
okay, let me reclaim my time. Can you give me a yes or no?
I don't
All right,
understand
okay,
the
you will
question.
not, you won't give me a yes or no. All right, so let me ask you, first of all, I did a little research myself, and I know that you've done some work with Goldman Sachs and in the investment banking sector. Have you ever lost $1 billion?
I have never lost $1 billion.
Would you enter into a business relationship with someone who had a track record of losing $1 billion?
It depends. If they made $10 billion and lost $1 billion,
All right,
that would be a
okay,
good
let
deal.
me move on. Would you invest in a business venture that has lost $1 billion?
Again, if it made $10 billion and
All
lost
right,
$1 billion,
thank you very
all day
much.
long.
Thank you, sir. Let me reclaim my time real quickly. I do have some concerns about the opportunity zones. I sent a letter to you. We haven't gotten a response yet. I hope that you will be able to respond to the questions that I've asked in that letter. Are you going to do? Did you get the letter?
I assure you that I will check with my group this afternoon. We very much support the opportunity zone, so we will be very responsive.
All right. I hope that you'll ensure that the program does not accelerate disruptive gentrification in those designated census tracts. Madam Chair, sir, I yield back. Thank you very much.
I share your concerns.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge...
The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you again for taking the time to be able to be here with us today. My home state of Colorado is home to a lot of institutions that play a very important role for our rural customers as part of the farm credit system. As you know, despite the fact that the Farm Credit Bank focuses on rural America, they have deep ties into the global financial system. As developments around Brexit continue to unfold, there is concern over possible spillover effects for rural borrowers. Could you help us understand what Treasury is doing to mitigate consequences that may arise out of Brexit, both in your discussions with your UK counterparts and with your colleagues in Brussels?
We've been very closely involved in these discussions now for close to the last 2 years. I think you know we're not primarily involved, but we have been having very close discussions, and I'm relieved that there was an extension, and I just hope that the UK and the Europeans take advantage of that so that we don't get to the brink again with a hard Brexit, which could have very detrimental economic impacts.
Thanks. I wanted to be able to revisit a topic that my colleague Ms. Wagner brought up in regards to the Belton Road Initiative and then also to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. What is Treasury doing to be able to pressure Beijing so that the Chinese do respect some of the same standards and principles that we and our allies uphold in terms of financial transactions?
Well, this is something that we are absolutely unified in working with our allies on. It's a topic at the G7 and the G20. I'll be going to Japan in the near future and focusing on this issue. The IMF and World Bank are, and I think there's a consistent view that proper lending to developing countries is appropriate. Inappropriate lending is not, and we have concerns about that, and there should be full transparency. They should play with the rest of the rules, as does everybody else.
I'd agree with that, and it's obviously problematic. When we're talking about the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, seems to be the go-to creditor right now for nations that are in need. Do you think that they ought to be able to have better development standards through that bank, and are there tools that we can use to try and be able to force that?
Absolutely, and that's something, as I said, we're very focused on.
Great. When we're talking about the World Bank, it's often rewarded for churning out large loans to middle-income countries, including billions each year to China itself. Tougher environments do tend to get left behind when we look at who they are lending to, even though the bank is supposed to be able to prioritize them. How can we address Beijing's Belton Road Initiative when it has major ambitions, obviously, in Africa, and shouldn't the World Bank be more incentivized to be able to tackle some of the challenging projects on the continent?
Well, let me just say I couldn't be more pleased that my Undersecretary for International, David Malpass, is now leading the World Bank. It's the first time in an awfully long time that we had an untested vote on this, uncontested. I think David is very focused on reforms at the World Bank and is very focused on these issues that you've talked about, making sure that the World Bank is lending to countries that really need the money and making sure that there are consistent standards throughout the development countries. So we look forward to his progress on that.
Thank you. And before I close, I do want to be able to make mention of your work related to the IAIS, Capital Standards for Insurers. We've got a 150-year-old system of state-based insurance regulation that seems to work well for consumers and for the market. And there is concern that the European-centric rules of the road will raise insurance rates in my district. Are you working to ensure that our system of insurance regulation isn't governed by foreign regulatory bodies?
I am, and I actually can just tell you, I just gave a speech to the large insurance group here. It was my longest speech I've given yet on this issue, and we'll make sure you get a copy of it.
Great. I appreciate that, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Secretary. I'd like to switch gears briefly and talk about the Financial Stability Oversight Council. Last October, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, known as FSOC, which you chair, removed systematically important financial institutions, also known as SIFIs, designation from prudential, meaning that no non-bank financial institutions are currently designated as SIFIs. Do you think it's appropriate that prudential, which New York Universities rates as the third most systematically risky institution in the U.S., now has as its chief regulator the New Jersey Department of Banking and Insurance?
We absolutely support the state-based regulatory system, and at FSOC, as you said, we've moved to a different system of risk-based management.
So FSOC then announced in March that it would no longer designate non-banks as SIFIs, and that going forward, non-banks would need to demonstrate a high, quote, likelihood of distress, end of quote, before being more closely scrutinized. A very high bar that non-banks would likely fail to meet until their impending collapse. Last week, former Fed chairs Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen joined former Treasury Secretaries Jack Lew and Tim Geithner in criticizing this move by FSOC, warning that it would be, quote, neuter the designation authority. Writing of their experiences at the helm during the financial crisis, the four regulators noted that the failure of non-bank financial companies was central to the propagation of risk from the financial system to the U.S. economy, international finance markets, and the global economy as a whole during the crisis. What do you make of this criticism? Isn't it true that FSOC just made it harder to protect against risks taken by non-banks?
Well, first let me say I think it's good that we have a system where people can put in comments on proposed regulations. I actually spoke to Secretary Lew about his letter. They have a different view on regulatory issues. It's a different time, but not unlike their letters, we'll look at other letters before we put in final rules.
And their views stem from the experience of the meltdown that we experienced in 2008. Would you please explain what recourse FSOC would have in a scenario like we saw in 2008 when AIG, for example, greatly expanded its sales of credit default swaps, becoming a major contributor to the financial crisis?
Again, because of the way we're looking at it, we would have picked up AIG in their risk associated with credit default swaps. The risk was primarily in the holding company and not in the insurance companies, which were regulated. And that's the type of activity under our new rules that we would indeed pick up.
Mr. Secretary, last week the Federal Reserve released its financial stability report and found that leveraged lending has grown and that protections that shield lenders from default on those loans have eroded. In light of the stern warnings like these, why has FSOC only convened on one occasion this year?
Actually, FSOC and specifically the private working group, the President's private working group, which is also associated on this issue, we've addressed this. We have calls in between formal meetings. So the primary regulators are studying this issue, and it's something we are not particularly concerned at the moment. We are monitoring very, very carefully to make sure this doesn't become an issue.
So you're not very concerned about a change in the economy and a potential recession looming?
No. I think in the near future, the chance of a recession is quite low. I think the credit quality is extremely good. In the case of leveraged lending, most of it has moved outside of the banking business into non-bank areas and areas that don't have insured deposits, and we take great comfort in that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield back my time, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank the Chair. Mr. Secretary, welcome back to the committee. We never get tired of our Treasury Secretary visiting House Financial Services. I want to raise an issue first on Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. Congressman Duffy and I wrote you a letter last November 30th about challenges in getting the appropriated funds by Congress out into the contracted private sector, both in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. Obviously, both the territories have a huge cash flow problem. So we appropriate money here. We give that money to HUD or to FEMA. That's approved by OMB and fully in compliance with Congress's wishes. And then it's allocated for projects in Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands. But they have no money to pay the contractors. So while I'm not suggesting that we should have a line of credit to Puerto Rico, there has to be a way within OMB and Treasury, with you as our chief financial officer of the country, of having that money flow. Because I've got subcontractors in Puerto Rico that live in my district that haven't been paid in over a year. It's just an accounts payable. The work has been done. It's met standards. Puerto Rico commissioned to do it, but Puerto Rico has no money to pay the contractors, and yet we have appropriated funds at FEMA to pay those services. So this is a puzzle. I got an answer back in February from your office, which was a non-answer, saying that we will contact other federal agencies for input and investigate the issue of barriers to timely payment. And so today I won't debate whether that was a non-answer or not, but I'd like to get your personal commitment that you'll help Congressman Duffy and I engage with FEMA and drive an outcome on this where funds can flow to the territories.
I'd be happy to do that. I actually spoke to the governor of Puerto Rico yesterday. We're very focused on opportunity zones there. We actually are, within Treasury, very involved in the finances of Puerto Rico. We actually negotiated a standby line in case Puerto Rico, through effectively its bankruptcy. What you're referring to, and I apologize, was a non-answer. I acknowledge it's a little bit of a form letter. The issues that you're focused on are issues of FEMA and HUD. I'd be happy to speak to the secretaries in DHS and HUD, Secretary Carson.
I think it would be helpful because I think at the sub-cabinet staff level we haven't made any progress. So I appreciate your attention to that. Turning to North Korea and sanctions, on March 5th, the United Nations Security Council released a report on sanctions compliance. It said financial sanctions remain some of the most poorly implemented and actively evaded measures of the sanctions regime. Individuals empowered to act as extensions of financial institutions of the DBRK operate in at least 5 countries with seeming impunity, and that includes, to say, diplomats of the DPRK in those countries. And of course, diplomats have immunity when they're functioning as diplomats in certain countries. My question to you is, how can we work with our UN sanctions regime and tighten financial sanctions on influence peddlers in China and in the diplomatic corps across the world with North Korea?
So my Undersecretary for TFI, she's recently traveled abroad to specifically talk about these issues, talk with financial institutions. We're very focused on money transfer items. We're focused on people doing money laundering. We're working very closely with the intelligence community on declassifying certain information and enhancing the UN sanctions with our specific sanctions against people who are trying to use the financial system. So I assure you we're on top of that.
Thank you. I was pleased to see in the Wall Street Journal today that additional sanctions are being proposed for Venezuela. And I congratulate the President and our UN representative for getting a UN Security Council resolution on sanctions in North Korea with Russia and China's approval. So my question to you is, in our national security work, is there a possibility we could get a UN Security Council resolution in a similar way with Russia and China actually being constructive on Venezuela?
I can't comment on the outcome of a UN resolution. I can tell you I was personally involved in the North Korea situation, and the Chinese were particularly helpful in getting that done. I personally have had conversations with the finance minister in Russia about the situation in Venezuela. I've also had conversations with my counterparts in China. I believe that Secretary Pompeo has had similar conversations, so this is something we are very focused on.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Yield back.
The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I want to continue on the conversation about FSOC and SIFI designation, but before that, I want to congratulate you. Congratulate you on making free trade advocates out of people that just in recent history have been totally opposed to free trade and never found a tariff that they didn't like. And so that gives me confidence from what I'm hearing by some on the other side of the aisle that's in the majority at this point. It appears that we have free trade advocates, and which I think will pave the way for USMCA to get approved. So congratulations on achieving something. I remember in the previous administration, many in the other party were even opposed to the previous president trying to get some free trade agreements because they like the tariffs. So I think we're making headway. And also, the obsession of some on this committee with the president's tax returns is not new. From the moment that he was inaugurated, there were some on this committee began immediately calling for the tax return. So just also want to say this. I'm not expecting a particular answer from you. So if you give something different than what I'm expecting, I'm going to let you answer, okay? Regarding FSOC and the SIFI designation process, hugely supportive of it. I think it's important to relieve the regulations on especially those non-bank entities. In fact, I'm working on reintroducing a bill from last Congress that actually passed the committee and passed the House nearly unanimously. So this is a bipartisan effort, and the bill would basically ensure that non-banks such as investment advisors and mutual funds are not subject to the bank-centric stress test. Quick question, do you agree with that approach, that they should be not under the same stress test as the banks?
Yes, generally I agree with that.
Okay, and I appreciate that. What are the differences between the banks and non-banks where it makes it where the stress tests are not appropriate for non-banks? What are those differences?
Well, the biggest difference is that banks have taxpayer-insured deposits that create risk for the government.
Okay, and I appreciate it. I think if we can continue in our efforts to reduce the regulatory burden on a lot of our industries and understand that even in the financial services arena, one size does not fit all, we'll do more to benefit the cost to consumer than anything else we're doing. So another topic that I want to address is, and I appreciate the administration starting to address housing finance reform. I do agree with the FHFA director that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac need to raise significant capital, but I strongly believe that we should start reforms in housing finance. How much housing finance reform can be done administratively?
I think a lot can be done administratively. We're working on that. We're also working on a report for the president. But I would also encourage, there is an opportunity for Congress on a bipartisan basis to make some significant reforms. These were not entities that were intended to be under government control forever and funded by taxpayer money forever. So I'd hope that Congress would look at this with us. But if not, we will do things administratively.
So is the administration willing to work with Congress to make some significant reforms?
Absolutely. I would look forward to working with this committee and others. This is a priority of ours.
I'm also encouraged that several private sector industries, mortgage insurers and reinsurers, for example, have a strong interest in absorbing risk from the GSEs. Does the administration plan to expand the involvement of these types of private capital in the housing finance system?
Yes, our fundamental view is that there should be risk capital in front of the government's money. And whether that's a government guarantee on securities or treasury lines, fundamentally there should be private risk capital that supports a liquid 30-year mortgage market.
And I appreciate that. And from my opinion, reforms is not just relieving debt and walking away from it. I don't think that changes any behavior when you just relieve debt and you reward an agency for bad behavior. So thank you. I look forward to working with you on these reforms and appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good to see you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
I appreciate your work to produce the report on non-bank financials, fintech, and innovation last year. As you may know, after 5 months, the committee was able to get around to creating a fintech task force on which I'm going to serve. Can you give us an update on your work to implement some of the changes? And are there any specific urgent recommendations you have for Congress in this area?
Well, I just participated in the FDIC hosted a fintech conference. It was extremely well received. We're working with the regulators on all of these. We appreciate the work that you're doing, and we'd look forward to sitting down and prioritizing what things you think you could get through on a congressional basis.
Thank you. How is the communication between other agencies like the CFTC, SEC, and the OCC? And is there anything we can do to better facilitate communication to reduce regulatory uncertainty in this area?
Yeah, I would say now versus 2 years ago, the communication is excellent between the people that run these regulatory entities. Again, whether it's through the President's Working Group when we convene, whether it's informal sessions on issues. I have regular conversations. We have monthly calls. So I think the communication is excellent. And one of the things that all of the people who run these agencies are trying to do is make sure down through their agencies, the regulators, that the message is sent to make sure that they work together. And an example I'd use, cyber, a very important issue. Different regulators should have cyber exams, but there's no reason that the OCC, the FDIC, and the Fed have to conduct 3 separate exams at different times. We're trying to get them to do that together. Just one of the many examples.
Right. Another report of the Treasury covered community bank and credit union relief. I've been hearing frequently from small community banks, particularly those that engage in banking for Minnesota's agricultural sector. Are you hearing from these community institutions, and are there any statutory changes you would recommend to deliver more relief to keep rural communities growing?
We're very focused on the regulatory burden on community banks. As I've said before, I think in many cases these community banks understand their customers, they know their customers, they know how to underwrite credit. They are a very important part of our economy. So we want to make sure that they are not struggling in overburdened regulation. And there shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all. Community banks don't need the same level of regulation as trillion-dollar global institutions.
Secretary Mnuchin, I just want to thank you for paying particular attention to every financial institution or entity within the financial services food chain, because as your last statement in your testimony indicates, they're all important, whether it's the Main Street community bank or credit union, all the way up to some of the largest banks in the world that are here in the United States that service all kinds of things here and around the globe. We need them all. And we need to make sure that people on the street get access to the capital they need to grow new opportunities that only benefit our local communities, but ultimately today's small business obviously is tomorrow's big business.
Thank you. I agree with you.
Thank you, sir. I yield back.
The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Secretary, good morning. Just a couple questions. First, obviously, and you probably had it a dozen times, and I'm just now coming into the hearing room, the tax returns are something that we've been seeking for a couple years now and have tried to, through the proper procedures, bring them to the fore based on the fact that every other president has released theirs. It's been a traditional, it's just sort of a matter of course, but then we've run into this stonewall, which is how we perceive it. And I understand, and I guess I didn't hear your testimony earlier, but the fact is that you hadn't seen a memo, but there was some sort of draft memo. Is that right?
I was just contacted by the the Washington Post 2 days ago. We heard it. I just first saw it this morning in the paper, and yes, it's some draft memo that never did get to us.
Who drafted it?
I have no idea. We're looking into that.
Okay. In your dealings with the president, has he asked you just to hold the tax returns and not?
No, I've never had any conversations with the president or anybody in the White House about what we're doing with his tax returns.
Okay. So this is all within the Treasury, that you're making certain decisions or not?
Treasury, IRS, which is within the Treasury, and the Department of Justice. We have consulted DOJ, which is effectively our lawyers.
How has at least the tradition of every other president releasing their tax returns, how has that played in your decision-making?
It hasn't played into my decision at all. I think that's an independent decision of the president. The American public knew that he wasn't releasing his tax returns prior for voting for him, and they made that decision. That to me is a personal decision of his and the American public. I have nothing to do with that.
Okay. And I guess from our perspective, obviously, we think there's something that's being withheld or covered up. But until we actually see it, till you release it, till a court orders it, we're not going to know. It's going to be all supposition on our part. And that's just the way it is. So I'm going to change the subject because really, you and I were adversarial sort of on DePasca, or however you say the guy's name. I don't want to do that. I want to talk about marijuana.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's rare that I would say I would prefer to talk about marijuana than those other two subjects, but I'm happy to.
So, Mr. Secretary, and thank you. Obviously, FinCEN and the Treasury have been willing to work with us as we've moved this subject forward. And I would advise you, sir, that at this point, we've had a hearing. We've now had a markup. We've passed the bill out of this committee, 45 to 11, I think, or something, or 45 to 15, 34 Democrats, 11 Republicans. It's now going to eventually get to the Rules Committee and to the floor, and we've included the FinCEN guidance as part of the legislation. So I don't know if you're familiar with how this thing is proceeding, but again, the basis is to try to get the cash off the streets. For me, it's a public safety kind of a matter, and I don't know if you all have been talking about it or if you've been following this at all.
I have been following it, and first of all, I appreciate what you're doing on this. I have before testified this is an issue for Congress to decide. We have a big problem, and the problem is there is a federal law and there are state laws. And from our perspective at Treasury, we are caught in the middle of this, both from the standpoint of the IRS, where we have to build cash rooms to take in cash, and from the banking sector. And I would encourage Congress to address this issue. It's got to be resolved one way or another, but it is not in anybody's interest to have this amount of cash on the streets, which obviously will just end up in illicit hands and in a bad part of the economy and things that are unsafe. So I can tell you we're having an interagency review on your bill, but in one format or another, I urge this is an issue for Congress to address one way or another.
Well, and I want to thank you. I want to thank the department and a number of your regulators because you have been working with us as we've moved this along. We've made some modifications based on suggestions, and we will continue to press this forward. I know it's going to pass the House, and then we'll see where it goes from there. And I thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was wondering, I'm going to raise the issue of the pending debt crisis, the default, the potential default. What's the best estimate for when that may happen if we continue on business as usual?
I haven't given an exact date, but I would say it's late summer. And I share your concern, and I would urge Congress to raise the debt ceiling as soon as possible.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the Treasury report on the macroeconomic effects of the debt ceiling brinksmanship?
I don't think I need the report to know the impact, which would be quite significant.
Were you in finance at the time and during the 2011 the Tea Party
I was,
crisis?
and let me just say I had a meeting with the Big Four yesterday, and I raised the issue of the debt ceiling with them. And again, I would urge Congress to raise the debt ceiling. We should have a situation where when we commit funds, we commit that we have the capacity to borrow. So I have no issue with Congress should have the ability to control borrowing and have the control of spending, but these things should be done at the same time.
I concur on that. The whole situation is sort of analogous to refusing to pay for a meal after you've eaten it. But actually, without objection, I'd like to enter into the record the Treasury report entitled The Macroeconomic Effects of Debt Ceiling Brinksmanship, dated 2013. So.
Without objection, so ordered.
Yeah, and I urge you to have a look at it. It's just a few pages, but it really, it goes through the drop in consumer confidence, small business optimism, S&P 500 took a hit, the VIX spiked, corporate bond spreads, mortgage spreads, it just was bad. Household net worth, the wealth of American families, dropped by more than, I think, multiple $1 trillion. This was a big deal when it happened, and, there's a danger of it recurring. Yesterday I introduced a bill that would, just a clean repeal of the debt limit so that we would actually use the budget rather than the debt limit to limit spending. And I'm not going to ask you, to opine on any specific thing. I understand there isn't really a consensus on the issue, and I personally remain committed to working in a bipartisan manner. There are proposals that were hammered out in the bipartisan policy group that would give cover to a number of Republican members who want to, at least maintain some sort of fig leaf. These are proposals that would defuse the issue, basically defang it, so that although it would technically still be there as a threat, it would just effectively not be so unlikely to be triggered. And so I was wondering if you would consider supporting proposals or maybe even taking leadership and trying to hammer out some sort of bipartisan permanent fix so that this thing doesn't come up again and again.
I'd be pleased to meet with a bipartisan group. We'd also be pleased to provide technical assistance. Again, in one format or another, the debt limit shouldn't be used as hostage to other things. It is. So I'm fine with keeping the debt limit as long as we have a mechanism that we kind of do these things simultaneously.
Yeah, so that, there's some mechanism where it would never be the limiting factor that would cause us to default.
Well, as you said, so we don't end up, you use the example of, you had the meal. I think it's more like we had the meal, we left the restaurant, we don't want to pay the credit card bill.
Yeah, and do you have confidence that the market will react appropriately, or there's a danger of overreacting if we threaten to default on our debts?
I have confidence that this Congress will not let that occur. From my meetings with senior leadership, everybody understands this issue, and I surely hope we never get to the point late summer where we're even contemplating these things. So that was one of the topics we talked about yesterday, and I would hope for the benefit of the American people we raise the debt limit soon.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Secretary Mnuchin, for being here. I'd like to ask you about the announcement this past March that the Treasury Department will allow companies to offer employees and current retirees a lump sum payment for their pensions instead of paying out the lifetime guarantee that employees expected. In Michigan, the Office of Retirement Services lists about over 280,000 retiree employees that participate in public employee pensions. That's a lot of people, and this move by your department will have a huge impact on the retirement savings of my residents in Michigan's 13th Congressional District. Do you believe that lump sum retirement payments shortchange our retirees as they would be getting far less than they would have received over time with their pensions?
Let me just comment. I pride myself that I'm on top of a lot of issues in Treasury and in the pension area. I am focused on the multi-employer pensions and other. This is not an area that I'm up to speed on, so I will follow up with you and get back to you.
Yeah, I would recommend to look at the Government Accountability Office. Had reported that retirees who take lump sum payments could see their assets drop. And Forbes estimates that by choosing the lump sum payment, retirees could receive a staggering 20 to 30% less than what long-term pensions would provide. Do you currently have any rules, and maybe you can ask your staff behind you, or do you plan to implement any rules that require companies to disclose this information to retirees?
We're unfortunately not sure specifically what you're referring to, but we'd be happy to follow up with your staff.
It's a decision the department, your department that you oversee in March, made a decision to allow lump sum payments for retirees.
You may be referring to the PBGC, which I'm a board member of. So let me, again, we'd be more than happy to follow up with you for clarity.
Thank you so much. Your department is also responsible for implementing the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, correct? Are you familiar with that before I continue? Okay. Which is designed to protect and preserve pensions. Do you think cutting benefits by 20 to 30% is a threat to pensions? I mean, you can answer that without actually referring to the rule.
Well, obviously, the pension issue in this country is a very serious issue, and particularly it's a serious issue with the PBGC and taking over pensions. I will tell you, as it relates to this rule, Treasury's role is purely mechanical, and that people apply to us for this. We run the tests and then determine whether it fits the tests and then go to a vote. We don't, it's not a subjective issue.
Well, my residents are also really concerned, though, Secretary, because with the huge amounts of profit that corporations are making off of these lump sum payments that you should be aware of. Michigan's Whirlpool Corporation, for example, estimated that these payments would cut $39 million off of its pension obligations. I want to ask you if your department will look into any plans that will require companies, again, to disclose their profit at the employee's expense when they shift to lump sum payments.
We'd be more than happy to look into that and get back to you. And as I said, the PBGC issue and pension reform is a significant issue.
Thank you. And I would like to discuss one last issue, if I may. U.S. pension plans with assets in Peruvian reform bonds. Many workers and retirees in Michigan, Secretary, have pension plans that are invested in these bonds, and unfortunately, the Peruvian government has not paid the U.S. investors the debts they owe, which this negatively impacts workers in Michigan. In the 13th Congressional District, about 30,000 people are in danger of losing their big portion of their retirement funds, with the government of Peru owing them over $34 million. Are you aware of that?
I broadly am aware of it, yes.
What actions in the U.S. and your department are you going to be taking in regards to solving this issue?
Well, again, this is not the only situation where pensions buy foreign government debt. There's other areas, and we assist the pensions, although it's not our obligation to enforce it, but we do assist in these areas.
Well, you know this. U.S. investors purchase these bonds in good faith and expect the Peruvian government would uphold their end of the agreement, and I hope you'll do something about it. I will be remiss, as somebody that truly believes in the rule of law, As somebody that has practiced law and is an attorney, I would advise you, Secretary, to get personal legal advice. Because the cover-up by this administration, it goes beyond just providing the taxes. You can consult the Department of Justice, but you personally making decisions not on the best part of the American people, but to cover up the occupant of the White House. I think you need to be very, very clear about what your role is and what your responsibility is to the American people. This goes beyond just providing taxes. Right? It goes about transparency and the fact that no one is above the law. So, Secretary, please seek out legal advice personally of what your obligations are, because the Department of Justice is not protecting you, it's protecting the President.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Zeldin, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to Secretary Mnuchin for being here today. One thing that comes up in this committee a lot when we're talking about effective policy is that a one-size-fits-all approach usually doesn't work. This may sound like another boring D.C. policy debate, but in my district on Long Island, imposing regulations meant for large international multi-billion-dollar banks on a small community lender, or the same capital standards meant for a massive international insurance giant on a small family-owned broker is not helpful. This subjective style of regulation that isn't tailored to the size of a company translates directly to less credit, higher premiums, and less opportunity for homeowners, businesses, and hardworking families. That's why I want to start off by saying I appreciate your work at FSOC to formalize an activities-based approach for addressing systemic risk. I commend you for moving away from the arbitrary designation of certain firms as risky, which is what the last administration did enthusiastically, and instead focusing on actually protecting markets and consumers from real financial risk by dropping the questionable one-size-fits-all approach. Mr. Secretary, last week, your colleague at the Financial Stability Board and its current chairman, Governor Randy Quarles, received a letter from 42 bipartisan senators regarding concerns about an ongoing attempt by bureaucrats in Brussels to export European insurance regulations around the world and into the United States. We then echoed those concerns in this committee during last Thursday's hearing. The European model is another perfect example of an arbitrary one-size-fits-all approach that would not work in our country, where we have 50 different states with 50 different markets that suit the needs of local consumers. I appreciate your commitment to protecting U.S. sovereignty and the state-by-state system in any negotiations where Treasury is taking the lead. The most important goal is to ensure the U.S. insurance regulatory system is deemed outcome equivalent. That means our system, and most importantly, our companies that are creating jobs in the U.S., can be competitive on a global marketplace, but not subject to European standards that don't make sense for American companies or consumers. This is a priority nationwide in my district for the local brokers who are insuring our farmers, our fishermen, and our working families. What I'd really appreciate from you today is an update on some of these international negotiations and what you're doing to prioritize American consumers. How can we put America first, but also open up markets overseas for American companies that want to be competitive abroad?
So thank you. On the international insurance issue, I just did give a significant speech last week on this. We'd be more than happy to get a copy of it to you. Team USA is what we call the interagency group of the regulators working with the Europeans, are very much focused on defending the U.S. state-based regulatory system.
Thank you. We are here in this committee having an ongoing debate about how hardworking Americans are going to have access to the American dream and how to keep our booming economy growing so it can continue to deliver opportunities for prosperity to all. We all have to work together to keep our system competitive in the global economy, but always put the needs of American consumers and businesses first. There are tremendous opportunities for American companies, including companies in my district, as we look abroad for those opportunities all throughout the entire world. On a personal note, I want to say thank you. You staffed up quickly when you took this position, and incredibly. There are a lot of really high-quality people at the highest levels of your agency, and it's been fantastic to work with all of them. So I just want to thank you for making them an open resource, because I'm confident, not just as a New Yorker, not just a member of the House Financial Services Committee, but as a member of Congress, that I am able to go to anyone on your team on any cause, any question that helps me represent my constituents as effectively as possible. So thank you for bringing in the best of the best to fill these important positions.
Thank you for the recognition of our team, because many people, some of which are here with me today, have given up very big careers to come and serve the government and are proud of being part of Treasury. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Now yield back.
The gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Phillips, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and greetings, Mr. Secretary. I come from the great state of Minnesota, home to a lot of farmers, and particularly from the 3rd District, the district I represent, home to a lot of multinational corporations from Cargill to Polaris and a number in between. And as you can imagine, I'm hearing from all of them on a weekly basis with concerns about trade policy and others right now. But I want to begin with just a quick question for you as you reflect on your first 2 years in your role. Is there anything, as you look back, that you might have done differently, or anything that, from an administration's perspective, might have been done differently?
Broadly, I'd say no.
Okay.
We've been incredibly busy across a large range of issues. So broadly, I would say no. We're pleased.
Anything?
With what we've done. Nothing that can come, but I'm sure there's small things here and there that, with experience, we may have changed.
Quick question about OFAC. Approximately how many people work at OFAC with the Treasury Department? Do you know that number?
We have several hundred people in OFAC.
Okay, and how many dedicated to Western Hemisphere and Cuba particularly, roughly? Do you know?
Well, the way we manage these teams is they are not necessarily, we move the resources around, whether it's North Korea, whether it's Russia, whether it's Iran, we tend to move all these resources. So it's a team.
So not dedicated to certain regions, okay. As you surely know, farm income is down substantially, over 50% in the last 4 years. Curious, why would we not open up Cuba to agricultural trade and help our farmers right now?
Well, the number one reason we wouldn't do that, Cuba is probably the single biggest problem in Venezuela today. Mm-hmm. They effectively have a national police there. The situation in Venezuela is just horrible. I mean, I convene these meetings, the economic situation, this is a rich country. Mm-hmm. The people are starving, and Cuba is a major reason for that.
Which I agree. Hopefully when Venezuela is resolved, is that a possibility that we might allow our farmers to sell product to Cuba?
You know, I would think, okay, that if Cuba changed their bad activities, that would be an incentive for them and a possibility. So again, the reason why we have the current Cuba policies is because of the way they're behaving.
My next question is about our China tariffs and Polaris as an example of a corporation in my district being significantly impacted, probably $150 to $200 million to the bottom line because of our policy right now. You know, what do I tell companies like Polaris, and what is the end game? How can I communicate why this policy is in our best interest and in their best interest?
Well, first of all, I speak to literally probably 100 different CEOs, so I'd be more than happy to speak to the CEO of Polaris if it's impacting them. If you get me their contact information, I actually find it interesting speaking to people.
I'd welcome that.
The president has been very clear. He wants fair trade, and we made enormous progress. Ambassador Lighthizer and I have literally spent the last 6 months negotiating a detailed agreement that would take up this whole book. As I've said, going word by word by word, I publicly said I thought we were close to an agreement. We were beginning to set up a date for the two presidents meet and a signing ceremony. I think it would have been the biggest change in their economic relationship that we've ever had. Would have been great for our farmers, for our companies, for our American workers. And unfortunately, China is taking a big step backwards. Now, sometimes you got to go backwards before you go forwards. I'm still hopeful we can get back to the table. The two presidents will most likely see each other at the end of June. I can tell you the president's very focused on farmers. The idea is not to have tariffs. The idea is for them to treat our companies fairly.
Okay. My last question is about our national debt and deficit. I'm gravely concerned. I wish this institution was as concerned as I am. Would welcome your thoughts about what you think this nation needs to do relative to our fiscal policy and the risks inherent in the current status quo.
Well, as I said, when we designed the president's economic plan coming in, the number one issue was growth. that we have to grow our way out of this. We can't cut our way out of this. I think the good news is we've achieved this growth, and we're way on our way to sustainable growth. Having said that, we also have to be conscious of expenses. Yesterday, I met with Mick Mulvaney and the Big Four and trying to reach a appropriate 2-year budget caps deal. We're happy to do that if the numbers are prudent. I think that the debt, we have to be careful of the debt to GDP ratios. In the prior administrations, in the Obama administration and prior to that, the debt has doubled. Some of that was a result of costs in the Middle East. Some of that was a result of fiscal policies. But I share your issue that right now our debt is fine, but we got to be careful that it doesn't continue to grow disproportionately to GDP.
So you share my concern?
I do.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I would like to use my time for the purpose of a question of order before this committee. Madam Chair, this witness, the Secretary, has been requested by the House to deliver to Congress certain documents that are pertinent to a legitimate inquiry before this committee. And my question is, basically, where the statute says that the Secretary shall deliver such documents and does not anticipate or embody any consideration regarding discretion on the part of the Secretary, would it be in order before this committee to hold the current witness, the Secretary of the Treasury, in contempt of Congress? That's my inquiry, and I would love a response.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lynch. The question that you have put before this committee is one that we're unable to address at this time. We will take your question to General Counsel, and we will put it in writing, and we will seek an answer from him or her about what our next step could or should be, given the way that you have described what you think may be contempt based on what the law says. So we will move with that as quickly as possible.
If I might just add, Madam Chair, the tactic of this administration and the strategy of this administration has been to circumvent the oversight responsibility of Congress and to basically negate the constitutional power that we have as a body by, in my opinion, unlawfully refusing to deliver pertinent information to an active inquiry before this committee and others, and that for us to continue to allow that delay to occur without meaningful consequences will cripple our democracy and be contrary, I think, to the Constitution itself. So I'm hoping that Council can act expeditiously so that we can actually respond to whether or not the Secretary is indeed conducting his job in contempt of Congress.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lynch. I think everyone who has read the information that's available to us about the responsibility. I beg your pardon. The time has ceased for us to have this colloquy, but we will take the information directly to General Counsel. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Before I yield to Mr. Cleaver, I would like to say to the Secretary that I did read the story about your father, and Jeff Koons, and I have to say it was a delightful story. I've never met your father, but after reading about him, he must be a great guy.
Thank you. And I would just say for the record, he didn't buy it for himself, he bought it for a customer.
No, it was very clear in the article, but just reading about him and his successful career in business and then his enthusiasm for art was a very happy reading for me. I just want to say that. But I do want to yield to Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. Mr. Secretary, this is just one short question. When you were here last, I represent Kansas City, Missouri, and the rural areas around it, about 125 miles away from the city. And I asked you about soybeans, and you responded that there had been a very large purchase, an order. Your exact quote was, a very large order while we're negotiating. They've committed significant orders in soybeans. So I responded, already, and you said, yes, already. I was excited about it. And so I started sharing that information to reporters and people back home. And my staff followed up the next day. And the next day, when I raised the question, you talked to some of the gentlemen behind you, and we can find no such orders that have been made, and it put me in a really awkward situation. I'm sure you misspoke, but something needs to be done. I think you need to acknowledge that you misspoke. I have your exact comments here. I don't want to be nasty. I just want you to know you put me in an awkward situation.
Am I allowed to respond to that?
Yes, it's Mr. Vargas' time. I yield back.
I don't believe I misspoke. I apologize. My staff didn't get you the information. We will share it with you. I will tell you that since the recent actions of trade...
Mr. Secretary, I hate to interrupt you. This is Mr. Vargas' time. But I have your exact... I have your exact quote what you said. I'm not trying to be mean or nasty. But when you tell me that I made a mistake, that's creating a whole new environment that I don't want to go into. And all I wanted you to do is just acknowledge that you misspoke and that you're going to get the correct information out. And if you're going to say you didn't misspeak and you're not going to get that important information out, I get back to Mr. Vargas. I don't want his time running out, Madam Chair.
I do want to make sure that you have time to respond, Mr. Secretary, if you'd like to respond to that.
Well, I apologize. I wasn't implying you made any mistakes. So we will follow up with you this afternoon to clarify exactly what I said and get you the information. So apologies.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cleaver. Reclaiming my time, I know that you've already, Mr. Secretary, again, thank you for being here. I know that you've already been asked about this, but I have to ask again about Chairman Neal's request. I think it does have a legitimate legislative purpose. I believe that you may not have been aware of the draft memo from the IRS, but certainly I wasn't, and now it has come out. And it seems to be somewhat clear that we do have the ability and the right to have that information. Again, I want to follow up. Are you once again going to take a look at it in light of this memo?
Well, I will take a look at the memo. I had not seen it till this morning. We didn't receive it. It was in the Washington Post. It was draft. So obviously we'll take a look at it. To the extent it changes our analysis for whatever reason, we would recognize that. Again, I think this is a very important issue. And I would just say we have tried to be responsive to Congress on hundreds, if not thousands, of requests for information. On this one request, we've been advised that there are different legal views, and this is why it will most likely go to the third branch of government. And if the third branch of government opines on Congress's right, then we would obviously supply the documents. Our issue is we want to make sure that the IRS is not weaponized for any party. And as I said, we've been advised, based upon constitutional issues, that it is not legal for us to pursue it. And this has nothing to do with anything else.
Okay, I do hope you go and review it again, because I think this memo makes it clear that we do have a right to this information. Again, my time has expired, but thank you, and again, say hello to your father for me.
The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Secretary Mnuchin, for joining the committee again here today. I do believe our diversity is our greatest strength and arguably the greatest contributor to our economy. Mr. Secretary, do you believe that representation matters in American politics and imagery?
I'm sorry, what's the last part? American politics
and imagery. Do you believe that representation matters in American politics and imagery?
Yes.
Oh, I'm so glad we agree. A few years ago, Secretary Lew put out a call to the American people soliciting feedback on ways to modernize our nation's currency. In April 2016, following long-time organizing efforts from several grassroots organizations, he announced a currency redesign overhaul that would more accurately reflect the diversity of our society. The American people understood the importance of representation on the banknotes of the world's most powerful economy. Representation that acknowledged our history and all those who have contributed. Mr. Secretary, yes or no, do you believe people other than white men have greatly contributed to this country and its history?
Yes.
Great. After 10 months of soliciting and analyzing responses, Secretary Lew announced that Harriet Tubman would be featured on the front of the new $20 bill. As it stands currently, our currency does not reflect the diversity of individuals that have contributed to our great American history. He followed the announcement by directing the Bureau of Engraving and Printing to accelerate plans for the redesign, so the final design concepts would be unveiled in 2020, the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote, which we celebrated yesterday. As you know, 2020 is only 1 year away, and since Secretary Lew's departure, we have not heard anything regarding the status of the currency redesign. Will the redesign meet the 2020 deadline, yes or no?
So let me comment that the primary reason we've looked at redesigning the currency is for counterfeiting issues. Based upon this, the $20 bill will now not come out till 2028. The $10 bill and the $50 bill will come out with new features beforehand. So the answer is, it is my responsibility now to focus on what is the issue of counterfeiting and the security features. The ultimate decision on the redesign will most likely be another secretary's down the road.
I'm sorry, I just want to be clear for the record. So yes or no, will you meet what was originally the 2020 redesign deadline? Yes or no?
Again, to be clear, the redesign that we are focused on at 20, no, we will meet the security feature redesign in 2020. The imagery feature will not be an issue that comes up until most likely 2026.
And I'm just wondering if you could explain that to me, because after an exhaustive community process where people who organized for quite some time, and you said you do share my sentiments and opinion that our currency should be more reflective of the contributions and the diversity of those contributions. So why the delay?
No, I didn't say that the currency should be reflective.
Well, you said imagery.
I said imagery, not referring to currency.
Okay, so do you believe that, do you support Harriet Tubman being on the $20 bill?
I've made no decision as it relates to that, and that decision won't be made in as I said, till
but there was
most
a community
likely
process. There was a community process.
Again, it's a decision of the Secretary of the Treasury. Right now, my decision is focused on security features.
Well, let me just say this. The occupant of the White House, Donald Trump, said that the move to put Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill was pure political correctness, and he, in fact, suggested putting her on a $2 bill. So do you agree that nearly a year of collecting response from across the country can simply be reduced to political correctness?
I think that right now I am focused on the security features of the U.S. currency, which is the reserve currency.
Reclaiming my time. So does that mean you have no intention of executing the redesign as planned by your predecessor?
Well, that is correct. I have not made a decision to execute on a redesign or haven't made a decision. But yes, I have not made a decision.
Can you commit to submitting a currency redesign timeline to this committee?
Again, the currency timeline will be most likely 2026. Which even in the most optimistic scenarios is probably beyond my term.
And do you believe that, is it your personal opinion then, since you won't offer it officially, that our currency should reflect the diverse representation of leaders that have contributed to this country, since you agree it's been more than just white men?
Again, I can't separate my personal opinion on these issues from the issue of the Treasury Secretary and my
So what is your position as the Treasury Secretary?
Again, my position is that I am focused on my responsibility to deal with the security features and a decision
okay,
that
you've addressed that. And what about imagery? What about the representation?
Again, it's not a decision that is likely to come until way past my term, even if I serve the second term for the president. So I am not focused on that at the moment.
I yield.
Gentlewoman from California, Ms. Porter, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Hello, Mr. Mnuchin. Thank you for being here. In June 2017, the Treasury issued a report on banking deregulation, suggesting that if Congress raised the $50 billion threshold above which U.S. banks have stricter oversight, that it ought to do the same thing for foreign megabanks. And last month, the Fed took this cue and they massively deregulated foreign megabanks. And this was on a wish list that you had suggested would be an improvement. There's a lot to be concerned about with this, but the most glaring is that now Deutsche Bank would only have to file their living will once every 6 years. And that's the same Deutsche Bank that had a surprise $3 billion quarterly loss. Based on your oversight of Deutsche Bank, which led you to believe it was appropriate to deregulate them, how did Deutsche Bank manage to lose $3 billion and not see it coming?
Well, I appreciate your concerns. Let me just say what we're focused on is the U.S. subsidiary.
I understand. Reclaiming my time. I understand. Could you respond specifically to how the hell do you lose $3 billion and not see that coming?
Well, I hate to say it, there were a lot of people that lost $3 billion and didn't see it coming.
We don't want to repeat that, you would agree.
We surely don't. I can tell you I am familiar with some of their really bad investments, and I find it hard to believe that they made them. But yes, it's a staggering amount of money we would agree on.
And Deutsche Bank has failed its stress test in 3 of the last 4 years, was fined for a mirror trading scandal involving laundering with Russian oligarchs, admitted to participating in a LIBOR interest rate scandal, and violated U.S. sanctions against Iran, Libya, Syria, and the Sudan. Most recently, it came to light that Deutsche Bank had willfully decided to ignore suspicious activity reports, SARS, with regard to the president and his son-in-law. What is your plan to hold Deutsche Bank responsible for failing to do appropriate oversight and respond to the regulatory controls that are in place with regard to SARS?
Well, let me just say the SAR issue I did read in the paper. I am going to have FinCEN follow up and make sure that Deutsche Bank, as anyone else, has SARS policies that are on everyone. So I'm not aware of whether this is true or not true, but we will have FinCEN follow up. I go back to our obligation of U.S. regulators.
Would you be willing to respond back to this committee as to whether that did or did not in fact occur?
I understand that we can't comment publicly on SARS, but we will follow back with the committee to make sure that we have done a compliance oversight, and whatever the result is, we are comfortable with.
Are you planning to ask the German banking authority to also do additional oversight of Deutsche Bank, especially given that we now regulate them much less than we used to?
Well, again, the U.S. entity, we will regulate considerably. So the U.S. entity with intermediary holding companies, we will be comfortable that the U.S. company doesn't jeopardize the U.S. financial system. In my conversations with the Europeans, yes, I will speak to them and make sure that they are properly regulating the parent entity, and I know the Germans share our concerns.
I wanted to ask you about FSOC's hedge fund working group. I had a conversation with Mr. Powell about that. FSOC's last annual reports in 2017 and 2018 included in each report 400 words about the 9,000 hedge funds registered in the United States, which collectively have $4 trillion in net asset value. That is $10 billion in asset risk per word of analysis from FSOC. And those words are, the Council recommends that relevant agencies continue to review their data collections and assess whether they are sufficient to allow the Council to monitor whether and how private funds may pose risk to financial stability. Why is FSOC just copying and pasting the same recommendations on hedge funds in 2017 and 2018? Do you not have enough staff at FSOC to prepare updated content? The last product to come out of the FSOC working group was in 2016. You're repasting the same financial recommendations even as the markets are changing and the risks that hedge funds facing are changing. In the 2019 report, will I see that identical 400-word content, or is the working group going to do some work and mix it up a little?
I very much appreciate your comment. I acknowledge that that's a lot of assets per word. We have talked about hedge funds. I believe you're right. This doesn't reflect, and we should not be copying and pasting, and we will update that appropriately. Thank you for
very
bringing
much.
that to my attention.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, Madam Leader. And I have a few questions regarding debt distress, which is quickly rising in Africa and Latin America. I come from the great state of Texas, and I represent one of the border districts that we're dealing with the grave refugee situation on our border, and we're really concerned about Central American countries. And the fueled by opaque loans from China, many lending institutions, especially those associated with China's Belton Road initiative. China has shown little interest in joining established multilateral mechanisms to coordinate forces on bilateral debt, let alone write them down if needed, as a major advanced economies have done for years. How likely is it that these countries are heading for a debt crisis, and how difficult will it be to resolve one if it happens?
I share your concerns. I've made some comments already, but I'll repeat them, which is we are very much working with our allies at the G7 and the G20 on this issue. We very much support debt transparency, and if China wants to lend, they should lend on the basis of everyone else with debt transparency. We're encouraging them to join the Paris Club. I think that would be important. We're working through the IMF and World Bank. So this is an issue. I share your concerns and is very topical and timely.
What are we doing with the IMF in order to have them pressure China to adopt global norms and practices? Are we doing something in that regard?
We are at both the IMF and the World Bank, where my previous Undersecretary, David Malpass, this is one of his big priorities. And I've personally had conversations with the governor of the People's Bank and other senior people there on debt transparency. So this is the French are leading an effort on this. There's a lot of unity on this issue.
I'm concerned, internationally, but particularly in Latin America, as my district is impacted directly. Do these developing countries have tools, including internal governance systems, that will enable them to appropriately evaluate the wisdom of the China Belton Road initiative and other projects? And if not, what are we doing to try to engage that issue in itself?
Well, this is an important area of Treasury where we provide technical assistance. And this is a specific area where I think without spending a lot of money, it's very, very impactful working with these governments that they understand what they're taking on. And, without me saying a specific country, I can tell you right now, as part of an IMF program that we are contemplating, as part of that, there have been discussions about debt repayments and everything else. So I can assure you this is a timely topic that this administration is highly focused on, so I appreciate your focus on this.
What is the IMF trying to do behind the scenes to get China to come clean on its Belt and Road initiative? Are they doing anything?
Well, again, I don't like to use the word come clean, because to the extent they genuinely want to lend, that's fine. But what they are insisting, particularly where there are IMF programs, and China is a lender, that the IMF, as part of its program, has full transparency into the sustainability of China payments. And we will not be approving IMF programs without having that going forward.
So is the Treasury engaging these countries and kind of educating them on the risks of taking these Chinese loans?
Absolutely. And as I said, the current president of the World Bank, who has worked for us, is taking this on as a major issue for the World Bank in his leadership.
Thank you. I yield back.
unanimous consent to yield to myself 5 minutes. I'd like to ask a few questions.
Reserving the right to object. 5 minutes for both the ranking member and the chair?
That is absolutely correct.
All right.
What I intended to do was to yield to you also.
Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, the law does not allow the Secretary to exercise discretion in disclosing the information provided the statutory conditions are met. Is that correct? Is that your understanding?
I believe subject to the Constitution of the United States, that is correct.
Okay. There was information released last evening, I think in the Washington Post, and the memo states the Secretary's obligation to disclose, return information would not be affected by the failure of a tax writing committee to state a reason for the request. Is that following? And the only basis the agency's refusal to comply with the committee's subpoena would be the invocation of the doctrine of executive privilege. Is that correct?
Let me just comment. I have no idea. I just saw that memo this morning. I've never seen that before. I don't know who wrote that memo. We will try to get to the bottom of it. As I've commented before, we will read the memo, and if it has any new information, but I can't comment on the memo. I just saw it today. I don't even know if it's genuine or someone made it up.
Let me just, since you did not see it, let me ask a few other questions. Did you discuss the memo with the President of the United States?
I've had no discussions with the President or anybody in the White House about releasing the President's
Did you have a discussion with anybody outside of the White House about this?
The Department of Justice, who is our lawyer in potential litigation, and we rely upon for interpretations of constitutional law.
I guess I want to make clear that you never discussed this memorandum with anybody inside or outside of the White House. Is that correct?
I have not heard of or seen that memo, okay?
My question is discuss. Did you discuss the memorandum with anybody inside the White House, outside the White House? I'm referring to legal counsel, I'm referring to lawyers, I'm referring to advisors.
Let me be clear. The only person I've discussed that memo with is my general counsel on the car ride over here who's sitting behind me. I have not discussed that memo. Oh, and actually I did ask the commissioner whether he had seen that memo, and he had not. But
my question is prior to
let me
the
be
first
clear.
time that you say you saw it.
No, I have not
was
discussed it.
this morning, is that it?
We received an inquiry from the Washington Post, I believe 2 days ago, about a supposed memo, and the first time I saw it was in the car ride over here.
Okay, the Treasury says it is following a legal analysis from the Justice Department, but the analysis has not been released. You have that analysis?
We have a conclusion, and as soon as the Justice Department, which we've asked them to work on expeditiously, has the full memo, it will be released publicly to you and to others.
Yeah, that is I would like to, as quickly as possible, get a copy of the analysis as soon as it's released.
I will assure that's the case. We are working with DOJ, and I want to get it released quickly.
Thank you. I just wanted to take this moment to allow you to modify, to change, to expound, to do whatever was necessary to make sure that you were comfortable with your statement about never having seen it prior to the time that you indicated, never having discussed it with anyone in the White House, outside of the White House, legal counsel, advisors, et cetera. I just wanted to make sure. With that, I yield to the ranking member.
Well, I thank the chairwoman. As we know, under congressional authority, it's the chair of the Ways and Means Committee and the jurisdiction of the Ways and Means Committee over that division of Treasury that we call the IRS. I think it would be appropriate to submit for the record the Washington Post story in question here. I don't know if that was been previously done, but it's the Jeff Stein, Josh Dawsey's story from the Washington Post. This posted last night at 6:46 p.m. entitled "Confidential Draft IRS Memo Says Tax Returns Must Be Given to Congress Unless President Invokes Executive Privilege." And I ask
without objection, such as yours.
Thank you. To that end, in my reading of the story, this was a draft memo. It was stamped draft. It has no one that it's written to, nor an author. And so I just want to ask you, you stated that you'd not seen the memo until this day. Do you mean you'd not heard of this or seen the memo until you read the news story? Is that what you...
Yeah, I mean, to the best of my recollection, okay, I don't ever recall seeing this memo. The first I ever heard of this was when we got a Washington Post inquiry. Now, let me just also comment of what I've been briefed on very quickly on this is this issue is different than the legal analysis that we've done. Now, of course, we will look at it and take it into account and make sure. But let me assure you, there's no smoking gun here. We did a very thorough legal analysis with the Department of Justice that, again, if this goes to the courts will decide and determine. I, for one, think this is an unprecedented issue of turning over any individual's tax return, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. And I would hope, we all hope, that we get to the right conclusion on what the right law is here.
So in this regard, just to make sure the record is clear, have you seen the memo outlined in the Washington Post story?
Someone handed it to me on the way up here where they took it off of the Washington Post. So not that we received it independently.
Okay.
And again, to the best of my knowledge and the people we've inquired, we have not received, nobody in the senior leadership had seen this before. So could be somebody in Treasury somewhere or another. Again, from what I've been told, I don't believe this is really that relevant to the legal analysis that we've done. But this is the first we're hearing of.
Well, thank you, and thank you for correcting the record. The final question I had, and I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record my letter to the Director of FinCEN, dated May 6th, asking for an additional briefing and data to support the legislation commonly called beneficial ownership here on Capitol Hill. I submit this for the record because I've not received a response back from FinCEN from my letter dated May 6th. I ask unanimous consent.
Without objection, such is the order.
And I raise this to you, Mr. Secretary. The Director of FinCEN has yet to provide any data to justify the position to have a massive new collection of the ownership data of small businesses across America. I raise it to you because I know you can and will be responsive. I raise it to you because one of your reports has not been responsive. The briefing I received from Director Blanco and his team was quite frankly insulting. It was anecdotal stories, no data in order to justify a substantial change in public policy. It would be infuriating under a Democrat administration for me to receive a briefing like that. It is even more infuriating when it's a Republican administration not giving Republicans on the Hill any sort of decency of data. Nor do I actually think when it comes to security matters that partisan question should come into play. But it's been one of the more infuriating issues I've had to deal with.
You have my personal assurance we will be responsive to you on a timely basis and make sure you have the data so whatever your opinions are justified by data.
Thank you.
I share your data view.
Thank you. And I appreciate it. And with that, I yield back.
I would also like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from One Campaign, the Bank Information Center, the International Trade Union Federation, and several senior fellows from the Center for Global Development that echoes concerns I expressed last month's hearing. The letter raises questions about the transfer of concessional and grant resources from the World Bank Group's International Development Association, et cetera, et cetera. I'd like to thank Secretary Mnuchin for returning to the committee and for his time today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions to the chair, which will be forwarded to the Secretary for his response. I ask the Secretary to please respond as promptly as you're able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you very much.